So I'm also working on food, but it's very different kind of food. It's more about history than future. Yeah. The funny thing is, the kind of, if you look at history, in most part of our history, people's understanding of our relation with food is fundamentally different from nowadays. This is because, human beings' relation with food is really cultural. If you ask most people in history, they have no idea about protein, about calorie, DNA, GMO. That's all out of my story. My story is rather it's really a kind of emblematic worldview. Food is more than nowadays understanding of providing you direct energy, but it's more about to show off your power and to have certain function, quite a medical function to certain part of your body. That's all the history about spice. But this kind of thing, although this sounds very remote from nowadays, it's actually so important in the making of the world as we know as today. Because I was trained in kind of Dutch colonial history. I think most Dutch people know there used to be a big company called Dutch East India Company, which almost conquered entire Asia. And that's how the Dutch worldview in 17th and 18th century golden age. Then Asia. Why was in Asia? We all know because Asia has some tasty food. It's more about taste, about spicy thing. That's why they send so many people to Asia and to this. It's kind of a way to discover a new world and to conquer it, to colonize it, and to make a lot of exchange of people and also species. But and then we all know this kind of thing in Dutch museum, the kind of spice ships. If you go to Dutch museum, there are a whole collection of that. But when I started doing my PhD 1.5 years ago, actually, I was thinking this history is of course too much Eurocentric. It's like kind of Europe as the center of, to consume the rest of the world. But if you go to Asia, Asia also has its own very spicy food. Spicy food was not only for European, it has been in Asia for a long time. This is a kind of, you can call it as hot pot or this kind of street food as you can see in China. It's not so expensive, but it's highly spicy. But there's another kind of food also might surprise you. This is if some Chinese who are wealthy enough to receive you a very high cuisine, very high banquet, you might have a chance to eat this kind of bizarre thing. But they think it's good for body. This is so-called kind of sea slug, also from sea. Might be also ecological if you but I don't know. But it's very complicated. It's a kind of it's animal. Disgusting, right? But if you cook it in proper way, it look like really high taste. That's how you eat. This is something a nest or bird, but this is normal. This is not normal nest. It's made by the spit. The saliva. From the mouth of the bird, and to make its own nest. And if you process it properly, it will look like something there. And if you cook it properly, then it will become very sweet and nice soup. And it's still nowadays considered by many Chinese as so important for femininity, to keep for female, for woman. It's kind of food with full of female meaning. So, but if you look, but the funny thing is, historically, none of these things was from China. They were all from outside. So nowadays you think that's only for Chinese, but those things originally was outside of China. So I call them as a kind of exotic thing or exotica. Then my entire research is about how they became part of Chinese food. So the first question is, when did Chinese food become spicy? The funny thing is, if you look at history, before the basically before the 5th century and before the early medieval period, China had no hot spicy ingredient. They had a kind of native pepper. It's called Sichuan pepper. But this is not really hot spicy. It's numbing. Nowadays you have the mala. The ma means the first character means this kind of thing. It's not hot spicy at all. It's with numbing feeling of the when you taste it. The first thing which could be called as hot spicy is pepper. Pepper was not native to China. It was from India. It only came to China to around 6th century, around early medieval period. Then the more spicy thing came. It's the chili pepper from New World, which replaced pepper. That's why nowadays it's difficult to find pepper in Chinese food. But in history there was a lot of pepper. That's the first part of my research. So I'm trying to understand when pepper came to China and how was it received. So basically the kind of appropriation happened around the 6th to 13th century. So I'll tell so many things about century. I hope it can make sense to you. It's about basically the medieval period. Then it's at the beginning it was introduced by Buddhists. You could not imagine Buddhists had much. Buddhists in India had much more spicy food than China at the beginning of the medieval period. So when the Buddhist was spread to China, its food was also spread to China. Then Chinese suddenly found we could not make spicy food as a monastery of the Buddhists. So they had to find new ways to get pepper. So also around the same period, there was a Chinese expansion by a dynasty called Tang, which all the way into Central Asia. So they could get some pepper from there. And so they could cook something like the India way, and with the introduction via the Buddhists. And also very important thing is in 11th to 13th century, there was a particular school which was very popular in China. This school favored this kind of aromatic and hot, also spicy things. And they thought that's good for your stomach. Even nowadays, it's quite like a European Galenic theory. You classify food into hot, cold, warm, and cool, this kind of character, and which will treat certain kind of disease. And that theory was also in China in medieval period. And according to that theory, those hot and spicy food will be good for your digestion system. So it's quite well received and also really popular. But the point is, at that time there was no. It's like in Europe, you had no direct way to go to the pepper land to get pepper. So you need some kind of discovery to build the whole maritime empire. That happened also in around the first is around the 14th century. That's basically around 2 centuries earlier than the Vasco da Gama. I think if you have anything about European history, Vasco da Gama found a way to India to get pepper from there. But the Chinese were also looking for that way. But it's quite complicated. But that was helped by Mongol, because Mongol conquered China, and they sponsored several expeditions all the way to India. And from the Mongol period, the food of China became even more spicy. That is kind of the heritage of Mongol conquest in China. Then they were famous, that's people all know, it's kind of the Zhenghe's expedition. This is the network of Zhenghe. In the early Ming, they sent huge fleet to cover the whole Indian Ocean to get back all these kind of exotica, and including pepper. Pepper was from this part of India, the southern part of India. So that's also where the network was most intensive. And then there came the Portuguese, and they had these two networks had kind of encounter and competition. And then there came the Dutch company. We all know Dutch East India Company, the great company of this country, and then they try to control Formosa, Taiwan nowadays, to make it as a as a place to sell pepper to China, but they eventually failed and was driven out and became the lost colony of Dutch Golden Age. But at the same time, you know, although I mean, I was talking about the late medieval period around the 14th and 14th to 16th century. Around this time, there was a kind of reflection in Chinese medicine and also food theory. They were thinking why we should take so much spicy thing, because it's not really part of our own food. So there was a new theory, particularly from the Mongol period. They said, okay, I mean, they were thinking, is it really good to take too much pepper? And then they began to have a new school, and that school replaced the old medieval school. And now they began to favor more towards this kind of cooling food. It's because pepper is hot. Then they would like something more moderate and more, maybe it's more tasteless. But they think this kind of is more close to nature. It's like, you know, the wizard and the prophet. You have different way of understanding. They said we should look for the natural taste of food instead of make it so artificial. And the along with, I mean, with and also around this period, the so-called New World was discovered. I mean, there was new food from America, and chili pepper came to China. So from 16th century, after chili pepper being planted in China, it became very cheap ingredient. So spiciness was no longer high taste because everyone could afford it as long as you could cultivate some chili pepper. So it's no longer like pepper had to be imported from outside. It's impossible to really cultivate them in China. China was too cold still for pepper. But for chili pepper, it's okay. So chili pepper became the food of poor people. But so those wealthy people are looking for something more natural, more healthy, and more tasteless. So they have to create a new kind of exotica. Then there came in. There was, you know, this is the kind of, this image is from around the 11th and 12th century. It's a medical, it's pharmacy. Then if you understand those character on the banner, is actually they're selling quite a lot of medicine with containing pepper. But if you go to the cityscape painting from the 16th and 17th century, I mean, it's about then what's preferred has been fundamentally changed. Now more, you can see more and more shops selling this kind of seafood and also those food with from particular link with sea. It has its reason. I will go ahead. The reason is. Because seafood is basically, particularly this kind of dry seafood, is moist. That's obvious, you know. Seafood is of course moist. Pepper is dry. The new medical theory think the moist thing is good, particularly because the dry thing is good for your stomach. But the new medical theory think stomach is not most essential part of your body. The more essential part is kidney, because kidney. For them, kidney was the most important thing for keeping manhood, for masculinity. Then, if you still remember the shape of sea slag, yeah, you know, it's really like the penis. This is the problem. So that's good for manhood and became quite popular. You know, that's the reason behind its popularity from 16th and 17th century. But at the same time, you still remember the nest? I know it's made of a bird's spit. You know, that's also moist because it can be, you know, from spit, but also and more important thing for bird nests is it looks very tasteless. But they do like tasteless. They think the more tasteless was more natural and was more good for body and more suitable for, you know, for the literati. They should deny this kind of heavy taste. Then it would be then first you look at this kind of the sea slug. This is how sea slug look like in the shop. It's very complicated. They developed very complicated conductor shape. They have all kinds of sea slug and with very different price. And for that reason, they would develop a whole trading network to collect sea slug, the sea cucumber. First from Hokkaido, that's also very important place for Japanese sea products industry, also seaweed as well. They produce a lot of seaweed. But the Hokkaido sea slug was only for Chinese market. So in the 18th century, they developed the whole trading network in Japan to exclusively supply to supply those market in China for the manhood. To keep the manhood. I mean, they thought that's very useful for manhood. And the second area was Sulu Zoo. We still nowadays know, have often seen the news about Sulu. It's because of this kind of the conflict between Christian and Muslims there. But why that area became so sensitive was originally because of this kind of thing, because this is a perfect place to produce sea slug, and they were Southernate. The Southernate became extremely rich. They were able to fight against Spanish colonial power and keep its independence for a long period, and the money was from this trade with China. And also, we have the Dutch East Indies Company, the Makassar. From 18th century, those people in Makassar began to use this kind of shape, or go all the way to Australia to get this kind of thing, and also exclusive to market in China. Then, the second thing I mentioned before, it's like this kind of nest. The nest, I mean, to get nest is also a very complicated issue. They had to climb all those coastal cliffs because those birds like to build their nests along in some coastal mountain, and you have to climb all the way to the cliff and to get to them. And the first area was around now the Vietnam and also the Hainan Island in China, but that was not enough to satisfy the market. So in 18th century, we see the Dutch in Batavia actually left a wonderful archive about how they sell this kind of the tax to Chinese for them to collect this kind of nest in Java, and also in the eastern part of Kalimantan there was a huge industry developing there, and partly for that reason, the English set up a trading post there, and which later on become nowadays Eastern Malaysia. Malaysia has two parts. One is there, one is there. So from this history, I mean, because all the way from early medieval to the early modern, I mean, what I'm trying to do is to actually it's more about global history, because I'm trying to build a new model about how to understand the globalization. The older model is based on I think it's like European consumptions. The basic thing is. If we are according to nowadays European model, the beginning of globalization can be somehow linked with crusade, because crusade went to Jerusalem and they found a lot of spice there. Then the whole spice trading began to develop between Indian Ocean and Venice via those crusade states in Jerusalem. Then because of all those change in Middle East, that trading route was often interrupted, and therefore pepper or this kind of spice became extremely expensive in late medieval Europe. That's why they began to equip fleet to find the so-called New World, to get new route to get spice. So one of the result was the Portuguese expansion in Asia. They found a way to go around the South Africa and to India, and afterwards they built a so-called Asian empire. And then there came the Dutch. The Dutch tried to kick off Portuguese and to occupy those trading network. And then there came to the English. The English invaded India and built the empire in India, and also invaded China. And anyways, it's really imperial expansion. But I think if we look from the other way around, if we think not only Europeans were looking for this kind of thing, then it will be very different. If it's from the other way around, we can see the so-called Crusade period was actually a high period of spice consumption in China. And they all got pepper from the same place. They all got pepper from India. For that reason, actually, I mean, during the so-called fluctuation of price in late medieval Europe actually has something to do with the market in China. They all went to India to look for spice, and there was actually a competition between these two markets. This is what I'm writing now. And then, in the 16th century, when Portuguese came, there was actually at kind of very tricky period, because at that time was actually the collapse of the Chinese network in this area, and a new relation was happening. And in the 17th century, when the Dutch was there, they had a lot of competition with Chinese network in Southeast Asia, but Dutch was actually not successful. They lost from Taiwan, and they could not really control the pepper market in China. And the 18th century is the most interesting part, because the 18th century, as we can see, for those very strange sea slug and bird nests, the Chinese was building its own, actually it's kind of informal empire covering entire Southeast Asia. It's not actually, nowadays in Southeast Asian history, the 17th century is called as the Chinese century. Also, if we look at from European perspective, it's actually the expansion of those European power in this area. But if you look at what's happening in the ground, it's actually those sea slug bird nests supporting a very Asian network, and that's dominating in some very remote area in Southeast Asia. What I'm trying to do for my research is to argue, to global history, not only European taste matter. I think it's nowadays still relevant, because nowadays we're trying to set up a kind of taste as a standard. We're trying to say this is of good taste. That's not, and that's often we often use different names such as technology and this kind of genetic modified, this kind of thing. But all these things often have some entanglement with power, and it's not neutral at all, because it's so much with the whole, the structural power there, the knowledge. But if you look from other perspective, even you take something. If you ask Indian people about this kind of vegetarian food, their understanding might be very different, and they might have think it's because they have a lot of religious reason. This kind of understanding of taste should also be taken into consideration in the globalization and in today's highly globalized world. This is the end of my talk. Thanks for listening. Yeah.